So good morning, everyone. My name's Jo Ingold from Deakin Business School in Melbourne, currently based in the UK for obvious reasons. It's a pleasure to be sharing this session this morning, which has been organised by my good colleague Elizabeth Cotton, who's the Editor-in-Chief of Work, Employment and Society. So I'll do some introductions shortly, but in this short section, I'm just going to talk a bit about the intentions of the event and also a few housekeeping rules so you have a good idea of how we're intending to run it. The first thing to say is that this is really intended to be a safe space to talk about mental health. We want it to be quite informal. We'd like everyone to feel comfortable to make contributions. The Q&A is going to be running throughout, and then there will be an opportunity to ask your questions through your voice at the end if you would like to. So you can kind of decide on your own level of participation, basically. We are very fortunate to have with us some extremely skilled and qualified people to talk in this area. So we've got activist perspectives, we've got the perspectives of professionals working in the area of mental health. So it's a great pleasure to all be together this morning doing this. So I just want to give you a bit of a preamble. So the event has been organised by Work, Employment and Society and the British Sociological Association. So Work, Employment and Society is the leading sociology of work journal, very highly ranked journal, which Elizabeth is the current editor-in-chief.
I love the way you say we're leading journal. I love it. We'll get away with it. It's our event.
We are, though. It's very highly ranked. Wes says if anyone follows the kind of impact factor stuff, we have gone up this year. Wes, I've been involved with Wes for about 7 years. And it's always a great group of people to be involved with. I think we tread a really good line between having solid kind of sociological based studies of work and employment, but also are known for being critical, being really at the cutting edge and kind of a bit radical, really, which is, I think, a great place to be. And also fantastic that we are highly ranked, because sometimes having radical critiques does not equate to you being well thought of in the academic rankings. So we're very lucky with Wes that we're able to do both. And we also have just a bit about Wes. We have the usual academic articles, and we also have on the front line articles where we open up to practitioners to talk about their experiences, which is really important. So this event fits in so nicely with those kind of aims of what Wes does. And we also have research notes opportunities where people can talk more about methods and ways of researching. So it's a great journal to be involved with, and we're delighted that Wes and the BSA, which is Wes is a BSA, British Sociological Association journal, along with the Journal of Sociology. So we're delighted to have the support of the BSA and of the journal this morning. And really, Elizabeth, I'm sure, will talk a bit more about this and the idea of this session. For me and for many of us, we're recognising the mental health crisis that has really come to a head during COVID, but the origins of that, as Clare and Rosie and Debbie will talk about, are not new. They've been around for a while. So we're going to really be looking today at different perspectives on mental health, particularly about Iact, so increased access to psychological therapies, so some critiques of that, and really the way that mental health is really a contested space. And has been used, it can be used, mental health interventions can of course be used positively, but we're also looking critically at ways that they're actually used in quite a negative, coercive way as well. So that's just to give you a flavour of how this morning is going to go. And I'll introduce some of the speakers as we go, and then of course they can introduce themselves as well. But just to say that we have with us Elizabeth Cotton from Cardiff Met, as already mentioned. We have Clare Slaney with us, psychotherapist based in London. We have Rosie with us, who let me get my notes, therapist and academic from University of Roehampton. And we also have Debbie McNamara with us, who is an activist and lots of other things. Now, I'll do a bit more of an introduction for each of you when the time comes. So a very multi-talented panel this morning, and I'm here just purely to facilitate and hopefully keep things running smoothly. And we also have Sandria from the BSA as well helping us. So thank you again to the BSA for supporting this event.
So I'm going to speak a bit about Uber therapy and digitalisation. So I'm taking an industrial relations and a sociological position on something that actually is very personal. In the past, I have worked as a psychotherapist in the NHS as part of my training. But actually my primary relationship with therapy is as a patient. And I think it's really hard to strike a balance between saying something important and critical and not making everybody feel really crap about what they do. So I want to start this event really with not with a disclaimer, but with a promise that being critical of Iact or the Iact model is not a criticism of the people working within it. This isn't an individual problem about us not working hard enough or not doing our work well. There is a systemic problem that we really need to understand if we're going to prepare for the future, because the future is emerging rapidly. And in my experience, even those of us working in the industrial relations field are not aware of how quickly we're moving from an Uberization, so a downgrading of a very important service, life-saving service, to digitalization, and what that might mean both for clients, patients, however you describe yourselves, we describe ourselves, and clinicians. I just want to also start by saying that I'm exhausted. And I'm raw after 6 months of no childcare with a 2-year-old child as a single parent, and also trying to maintain, I think, a career, but at least a job. And I know that this is the case also for people engaging in therapy. And I think it is, I'm just very grateful to the participants of this event for continually putting themselves forward to say important things. I've known some of you for a really long time, and we have been repeating ourselves for maybe a decade about what's happening. And I know that often we get to a point of frustration, particularly on social media, where middle-aged women don't fare so well, and we've all taken a sustained beating. I think that our bravery, our continued bravery and activism is crucial at this time, because talking about mental health puts you in direct opposition to the very powerful financial interests that are now at play. And I come from a trades union background. I used to work for the Miners International, so I have a sort of slightly paranoid and sometimes it feels like an exaggerated view of what can happen, how bad it can be in work, but actually my experience says it's worse than you think it possibly can be. And I think that if we are going to understand and even organise in response to what's happening, we have to be very serious about the amount of pushback there is for taking an alternative position. Gamification of the evidence base, I mean, gosh, hasn't that got resonance now? Doing the track and testing, you know, it really is the worst kept secret in mental health. The Iact model, and I'm talking about the Iact model rather than Iact services per se for two reasons. One is that Iact services are very patchy. So there are some services that you could define as good, where people are working and they feel that they are able to work in a way that is therapeutic. Some services not. Also, you don't have to be working within Iact in order to be using an Iact model, because the financial model, it's not a clinical model, the financial model of Iact is everywhere. It's the context within which public health services operate. And what has become really known is the gamification of the evidence, particularly around claims of 50% recovery rates and these very light CBT techniques. Most people would argue that they don't really constitute therapy in many cases, particularly online. So it's terribly hard just to say that. It is rejected. You are demeaned and humiliated if you raise this in any of the mental health settings. The professional bodies can't talk about it. There aren't very many spaces where you can have an adult conversation about why are we continuing with a system that is actually making false claims about what it's doing. And the question really, as a trades union question, is, so who is benefiting from this system continuing? So I want to present firstly just a little bit of data from all the many really bad surveys that I've done in mental health from the perspective of workers, people who work in the sector. It's all up on thefutureoftherapy.org, another kind of stupid thing to do when you're academic, just give away your data, but there you go. And I just want to give you a different version of what it means to be a psychotherapist or counsellor or mental health worker in this country. So I did a big survey in 2017, 1,500 mental health workers. 28% of those workers outside of the NHS earned less than £300 a week. So one of the big secrets is that many people working in mental health are poor. Many go to food banks. And for those of us that have had therapy, the thought that our therapist doesn't earn enough money to eat is pretty challenging in terms of how safe we all are working in this way. 21% of psychotherapists and counsellors work unwaged, at least for some of their time, as part of their training, as part of their accreditation to professional bodies, but also people who've retired or who simply can't get paid work. So there's a chronic exploitation of a really demanding and highly qualified workforce to work for free. The pressure is there. I think it's almost impossible not to do that. I used to run a series of seminars when I was trying to organise psychotherapists and counsellors called "Do you have to marry a rich man to be a psychotherapist in the UK?" And the answer is, for many people, yes. 30% are self-employed, so there's also this sort of idea that people working in the NHS actually work for the NHS. Well, they don't. So, you know, many therapists have maybe 3 or 4 patients, so they're on 0-hour contracts essentially. 58% of Iact workers raised concerns about patient care, and that's across the sector, it's 38%. So neither of those statistics should make you happy, but there's a significantly higher number of people within Iact who are unhappy with the standard of care. I did another survey last year just for Iact workers, and it's a relief that this statistic was finally kind of, you know, concretized. 41% of people working within Iact have been asked to manipulate performance data. And that can be things like recovery rates, it can be in terms of people turning up, it can be redoing assessments to get a more positive response. 68% of Iact workers have experienced depression and anxiety as a result of working within Iact, and 70% have experienced burnout. And the question was quite uncharacteristically for me a very clear and well-defined question. It said, as a result of working in Iact. Now these are catastrophically high figures. 68% depressed and anxious. These are the therapists. these aren't the clients. 69%, however, felt that they were providing good care. So there's a tension within the system of people who are struggling on, who feel that they're able to offer good care, but actually at a very, very high cost to them, both financially and also emotionally. I did another survey for a network called Partners for Counselling and Psychotherapy, which is a progressive network, which I think Clare might talk about later on, about the impact of COVID. And I think I'm going to redo that survey because 6 months on into this change, this radical shift in mental health work, because most of it has gone online. But what we found was that already 50% of self-employed mental health workers are not able to sustain themselves on their current income, and that was taken maybe 4 months ago, and 78% are not able to sustain themselves working for an employee assistance program, which is one of the big sort of employers and growing employers in the sector. So the picture is already not good in terms of precarity and income insecurity. Now, Sandra, can you do me the favour of putting up my first slide, which is entitled Hurtling Down the Rabbit Hole? So I was feeling a bit kind of depressed about doing this talk, because I think you have to be very careful about criticising actual commercial providers. You do have to be careful about it. But I've been to a series of online events like yourselves, which have just been so sort of audacious, where people have so freely spoken about what's happening within the mental health sector, particularly around digitalisation, that I'm going to give you some quotes from high-profile people who are working in the digital mental health field, to give you a sense of how freely this is talked about. You don't need to be an academic to find out who is making money out of digitalisation of mental health services, or what this means strategically. So this first quote is about the financial logic, and I think it is important. I mean, you could say this about academia and also mental health. It's important just to understand that the financial logic really does dominate. It's true what we write about neoliberalism. It determines what services exist. So this is from a private digital provider saying, data insights improve quality while driving down unnecessary costs. So this is a company that is way ahead on using AI and automation to carry out monitoring, supervision, chat sessions, which are considered therapy by this company, and also diagnosis increasingly. And it's there to reduce costs. Another quote is from a company which designs apps and chatbots, and it says, we are balancing user wants. And I'm just really fascinated by this terminology around user wants, that there is a commercialization that's happening and a commodification of the therapeutic relationship in this process. It's necessarily so. Another is from an online provider of therapy who is also engaged in data mining. So using the data from online sessions of their clients, 250,000 online sessions, to do data mining. So we're data mining therapy chats for cognitive and emotional tags in order to develop monitoring and diagnosis tools. For those of us who are labour academics, the whole thing around algorithmic management and surveillance at work, particularly around emotional and cognitive tags, is terrifying and, you know, a big area of research now. But I think one of the things that I take from this is it's important to understand that the technology does what it does. It doesn't necessarily do what we want it to do. So I don't think there's anybody working in mental health who thinks that more monitoring and more automated diagnosis, the medical model, is helpful in any way, or even comes anywhere close to providing therapy. Another point, so there's one person who's had a number of these quotes, said at the end, when I challenged him and I said politely, you know, have you ever heard of the National Audit Office of 2018 inquiry into the gaming of Iact data? He claimed that he had never heard that the data that they're using, the Iact questionnaires, standardized questionnaires, were giving false data. And he said, our data is published in journals. So I'm not going to have a pop at academia, but yeah, this stuff gets published as well. And then the final quote comes from one of the father figures of Iact at a conference, at an Iact conference at the end of last year, that a friend of mine went to. And of course, the Iact model is moving almost entirely over to virtual and digital services. And they asked the brilliant question, did anybody actually ask for this? And the father said, nobody asked for it, but we're still doing it. So that decision was made several years ago, and what's happened within the sector is COVID-19, which has speeded it up dramatically. Sandra, could you go on to the next slide? I will send out after this event a series of slides. So I just want to very quickly say this is not new, the idea of Uber therapy. By the way, when I started using the word Uber therapy, I didn't know that Uber Health actually exists as a commercial company. So in a way, I think it's quite useful to use this language, because there's often a confusion within mental health and clinical services that somehow we haven't been industrialized, that we're not talking about industrial relations when we really are. But the central argument that I think is right, and it certainly seems to be my experience, it seems to be backed up in my research and the interviews that I've done, is that the downgrading of therapy into a standardized, manualized, and now digital model has opened up the doors for the ending of clinical work, highly experienced clinical work in the public sector, and also the development of the emergence of big healthcare and digital providers, and the incredibly valuable industry of AI and data science, so the data wars. And mental health has now opened up to that. Next slide, please. So there are two things that I just want to say about that. We've talked for a very long time about what the consequences are for the therapeutic relationship, but again, I've used a provocative term, therapeutic Tinder. So what does happen to the therapeutic relationship when, for example, you access therapy through an online platform like Uber? It's only one form of employment, but it will be a growing one as people are sort of interacting remotely. And these are two quotes from two big online therapy providers. Therapy for all, wherever you are, whenever you are. Learn to live without the suffering that comes from depending on your partner, friends, or other people with the help of a specialist. Well, as far as I seem to remember, that is the agony of therapy, that you become dependent on somebody and you allow yourself to do that. And there is just something on a very practical level terrifying, I think, for a lot of therapists, that suddenly the image that they give, that their marketing ability, their commodification has to be done in order to attract clients increasingly. And then the final slide is really about algorithmic control. Again, it's another massive area, certainly for WES, is about how when automation is introduced, there is also an issue of algorithmic management, how both the client and the therapist are being managed. And there are really very important sectoral developments that are happening now to get the metrics to do this algorithmic management. So we already have standardized questionnaires or metrics for service users in terms of their recovery and the impact of the therapy. But there are also developments by these private digital providers to set up standardized metrics for therapists. And this is very closely linked to the big debate within the professional bodies around scoped, which is around regulation, but also introducing a capabilities approach to therapy. And these things are interconnected. So putting it bluntly, we are entering into a period of automation, of surveillance, and algorithmic management. Okay, Sandra, you can take the slides away. I just want to say something very quickly about how do we prepare for this. Well, I think carefully is my answer to that. I think one thing that I think we have to promise each other, certainly those of us that are involved in progressive networks, activist groups, is to understand and take seriously the issue of surveillance and try and protect the spaces where we meet and talk as best we can, given that we are going to be doing a lot of our organising work online. So I think getting up to speed. I'm personally heading off grid as soon as I can, but I think that there has to be a much greater knowledge and skill sharing and technological sharing between activist groups on how do we create safe spaces. But I think there is also an opportunity in the real erosion of trust in the evidence in our society to try and steer the mental health debates, which are chillingly positive and chillingly individualized and cynical as a result. That we have to be brave and we have to face up to the real lack of evidence around the current delivery of public mental health systems and find alternative ones. And I know that Debbie will speak to that. I think that there's a very painful statistic, and this is my final point, there's a very painful statistic in one of the surveys that I did, which is about how do people raise concerns with colleagues. So across the whole mental health sector, if you worked in the NHS, 14% would raise a problem with a colleague. But in the private sector and third sector, which is big, only 4% of people working in mental health are able to raise their concerns with their colleagues. So in a way, it sounds a bit lame, but I think there's something really striking about how important relationality is to people working in mental health as a discipline. This is what we do, we build relationships, and how little of our time has been spent in building relationships with each other. I think the technology is a really important part of that, and in the follow-up to this event, we'll be listing a number of progressive organisations and networks that you might consider joining. But I think that the primary concern is for us to conserve our energy so that we can do good work in pushing back the Uberization of therapy. And to do that requires real organising and us committing the time to organise together. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Wonderful start. And some amazing insights there. We've had a couple of comments in the chat. We haven't had any questions yet, but there's still time to ask questions, everyone. If you'd like to put any questions you have for Elizabeth, we've got time just to answer one or two. I just want to pick up a few things in the chat. Yeah, thank you, Harriet. Totally with Elizabeth on this, critical of Iact as an approach, so positive personal experiences, which is really interesting, valuing practitioners, even when they're having to work, it's the kind of system design that's problematic.
Can I say something about that? Because we often skip over it, and I'm never quite sure that we get it right in our discussions, because people do get really, really offended. And Rosie, myself and Clare were involved in an event publishing Rosie's great book, Industrialisation of Care. And at the end of this event, somebody who managed an Iact service spoke up of her pain at being victimised and criticised by this intellectual group. It was a really painful moment because we didn't really know what to do, and we're all kind of semi-nice people, so we didn't really want to challenge it. But I think that that's one of the hardest things about this debate, is it requires us challenging our own work. In trade unions, there's an acceptance that you are doing a dual task. You are both criticising, critiquing, and trying to change the systems within which we work, but you're also trying to keep your job and keep going. So there has to be a kind of, it's a very painful process for people to suddenly say, well, I believe in myself, or I believe in my patients, or I believe in my colleagues, but the system is wrong. And you have to have that kind of ambivalence in what you're doing. And I think particularly when workers in mental health are so stretched, you're being pulled apart financially and emotionally, it comes at a very, very high price, that it can be very, very hard to sort of take a breath in and say, okay, I'm going to look honestly at the system. But it has to be done, and we have to support each other in doing that, which means accepting each other when we're angry and we're ranty and we're not, saying clever stuff. because if we don't challenge it, we don't change it. I just have a real fear that if we're not informed, if we don't allow ourselves to be informed about what's going on, we will just miss the boat. We just won't have anything to say about all of these digital therapies that are being made available. It'll be nothing to do with us. I can't hear you.
You're on mute, Jo. So I want to pick out a couple of questions from the chat. There's an interesting question about therapeutically sharing concerns with clients that I'm going to park actually, and I'd like to come back to that when it. But unless you'd like to answer it now, but
no, actually there are better people in the room to answer that.
I thought we're coming to this.
That's a great question. Can we have that back at the end?
Yes. I'm going to note these, and there's also some interesting stuff coming through about the political, which very much fits in with Clare's and Rosie's approaches. But I want to just pick out the question that's about the impact of these trends. Thank you to my good Wes colleague, Angie, and Antipodean colleague. What do these trends mean for health insurance and potential workers' compensation claims? I mean, I know. Well, the NHS system is slightly different, isn't it, with system to other, but you know, health insurance, if you've got.
Well, I mean, this is very crude, but I mean, in the UK we see it in terms of psychocompulsion, so the use of Iact services to claim recovery and reduce benefits. So I think it is this crude in the thinking. So. If 60% of disability benefit claimants are on the basis of mental illness, and Iact says that it recovers people by 50%, somebody in the DWP has thought, well, there's a way of halving our disability benefits bill. So there is, at the moment, the mental health services linked to job centres are voluntary, but they increasingly just won't be. And the problem with this Iact model partly is it's very individualizing because it decontextualizes social crisis. And it just says, if you failed to recover as a result of going on an Iact course of 4 sessions, then there's a question mark about you rather than about the intervention. So in terms of what you get in the public system or in the insurance system, increasingly it is a very manualized cognitive behavioral therapy model that will claim that the evidence suggests that you should be recovering, at least 50% of the people should be recovering. So there'll be limitations put on the number of times that you can do it. There's just really unrealistic expectations. And there's a form of psychocompulsion because it will be saying you can get better if you try hard enough and if you engage with this therapeutic model. And it's where the unrecovery movement, you know, is so important, in that it's a very brave statement to say, we reject that model. We think there is a social model of mental health, which you're missing here. And that's what we want to engage with.
That speaks really nicely to some of the points coming through the chat, which we will pick up later in our discussions. I'd just like to ask you a final question, Elizabeth, that's come out in the chat, which is whether the current COVID context is almost being exploited by government and other powerful actors to make it difficult for collective responses to kind of isolate therapists and workers and other, you know, and clients further, and whether you think
yes, listen, times of crisis, war, somebody makes money. So there's 2 things happening. One is that some companies have been planning this for 10 years and it's now happening. So it's all, you know, they're in action right now. And I think the blame game has really kicked in. And I think the attempts to divide us, to blame, and to bully and to split us, you know, in psychotherapy, splitting is a powerful defense, is extraordinary, which is why I think this sort of point about how we have to tolerate each other, because it's really hard to have these conversations because we don't agree on the minutiae and we get raw and antsy, but we mustn't let that experience, how we feel about this, get in the way of us organising. We have to accept that we're at our sweaty, red-faced worst, but we still have to go ahead and build those relationships. And I think there are always, in times of crisis, opportunities to do that, because people recognise that what we're being fed on a policy level is completely divorced from reality and represents financial interest. But it's on the micro, isn't it, of strategically, this is exactly what's happening. The question is right. But then the question is, what do we do? Well, one of the things that we do is that we accept where we are, and we accept that in a very kind of grungy, slightly kind of frustrating and irritating way, we've got to find alternatives together.
Thank you. And I will pick up on the other points that have been made, and please keep your questions and comments coming, and we will address those as we go through. We have plenty of time, which is wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for a very thought-provoking and important opener to our session. So next, we're going to move to Rosie. Rosie is a therapist and academic from the University of Roehampton, researches into the work and politics of mental health, co-editor of the fantastic book, The Industrialisation of Therapy, which I highly recommend that you take a look at. So yeah, we'll be sending out resources after this. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Rosie. Thank you, Rosie, for being with us.
Thank you, and hello everybody. It's really good to be here, and I must thank Elizabeth particularly for asking me along today, and she has wonderfully kind of opened up the whole area for us to think about. I just want to, in a preamble, want to reiterate something Elizabeth said right at the beginning. There's a big difference, isn't there, between criticism and critique. I think it's as well for us who are involved in these matters to be sensitive to that difference. Critique has to do with questioning and thinking very hard about the way our services and institutions are structured. It's not just naysaying. It's not just gratuitous mudslinging because we don't like something. I think critique has a very serious function in society, and many of us know, particularly those who work in universities, that critique is under threat at the moment. And so part of the value of a session like this for me is that we are sort of engaged in a critique of something, not just criticizing it. So I just want to start by saying that. I'm a psychologist, and I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I've worked in the NHS for over 25 years, and I'm Professor of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy at the University of Roehampton, where I spend a lot of time thinking about all this kind of stuff. And so I'm going to be talking very briefly, only for about 10-15 minutes. I'm going to be talking from my experience as a psychologist and psychotherapist in the NHS. And most of my time in the NHS was spent in a service that became an expanded Iact service. And one of the things that I came to realize about Iact is that, like many mental health services through the ages, it's a very potent site of myth. And of course, I guess that sounds a bit odd. We usually think of myth as something that belongs back in ancient Greece, but myths aren't, of course, just ancient stories. Organizational myths are central to the work of public sector services, and particularly mental health institutions. So I don't think it's altogether surprising that we find three extremely powerful modern myths emerging from within the government's Iact programme. And let me come straight out with them, straight to the point. They're full titles: The Myth of the Sovereign Consumer, The Myth of Transparency, and The Myth of the medical cure for unhappiness. Now, these are organizational myths that powerfully shape the way we think about ourselves and the way we understand psychological distress. And as I hope to show, if only very briefly and very partially, they're also an organizational means to a political end, one that I think serves the neoliberal agenda underpinning many of our public sector services today. So why do I call them myths? Well, organizational myths do have certain characteristics. Firstly, unlike Greek myths, they're not always dressed up in attractive storylines. Instead, they're usually couched in what Barth says is innocent speech, something that's superficially obvious or that goes without saying. Myths are widely held but tacit ideas, beliefs, and ideological positions. And in that way, you could say they operate a bit like dead metaphors. They kind of embody ways of thinking that have become so conventional, so normalized, that we fail to notice their metaphors at all. Secondly, while myths are usually presented as something natural, a bit like the weather, they're no such thing. They're actually social constructions. They're produced and developed in response to a particular time, context, and culture, and they evolve as a way of meeting particular organizational demands. And these demands are generally concealed within depoliticized speech, where anonymous statements of apparent fact mask the intentions of an organization. And finally, because they're so embedded in everyday thought and language, organizational myths are never interpreted. They're actually believed. And when they're believed, they're adopted as a kind of sacred narrative whose truth and validity can't be questioned. Generally, the truth of a myth is never established. It's rarely investigated. Any attempt to critique or examine or deconstruct the myth reveals a lack of belief in it and something that's usually regarded as a betrayal by the organization concerned. So those are some of the ideas that I have about organizational myths, and I just want to briefly touch, as I say, only very partially touch on each of these three modern myths in turn. So let me start with the myth of the sovereign consumer, and this is probably one of the most persuasive and powerful myths circulating within the public sector today. As we know, the prevailing philosophy of neoliberalism, which we have today, we all know and love, has ensured that the methods of the marketplace have been transposed into mental health care. And the effect of this, as many of us know, has been seismic. And I want to pick out only one of its consequences. In a competitive NHS market for care, where I can choose mental health for myself, the notion of relationship is tacitly replaced with the notion of transaction. In a relationship, the ties that bind us together render us vulnerable to and dependent on each other, and Elizabeth was talking about that a moment ago. But in a transaction, we're bound not by the ties of relationship, but only by the logic of the marketplace. We become individual consumers responsible only for ourselves, and we're driven not by the need for care and recognition from others, but rather by the need to maximize our own personal benefit. So the myth of the sovereign consumer is underpinned by a belief in the value of self-sufficiency, and most of all, the value of paid employment. And indeed, the success of Iact is predicated on returning large numbers of people to work who would otherwise be drawing on the public purse in the form of welfare or benefit payments. But the precaritization of the population that's established via the institutionalization of temporary labor, we have 0 hours contracts, the gig economy and so forth, not to mention the dismantling of our social and welfare services means that the very conditions necessary to realise such self-sufficiency are undermined. And in fact, there's a tacit agreement within Iact services to ignore the way in which a commodified demand for self-sufficiency produces and sustains the very emotional distress it's there to relieve. And I think this is one way in which the myth of the sovereign consumer continues to be upheld. Okay, let me turn to the second modern myth of Iact, the myth of transparency, one of the most cherished ideals of the business world. Organisations, of course, adopt transparency as this kind of ideal that ensures legitimacy and respectability and a guaranteed route to operating without blame. And to this end, as many of you will know, Iact practitioners are amongst the most closely monitored of any mental health practitioner today. They train in, they carry out standardized assessment and treatment protocols, they record multiple clinical outcome measures for each client contact, and they are pushed to achieve ever higher activity and clinical outcome targets. Elizabeth has talked about what that looks like in some detail. What I just want to note here is it's a kind of disciplinary context to which both the staff in Iact services and the patients and the clients are subject. And it's all part and parcel of what Michael Power has called the audit culture. Now, in an audit culture, we don't question this demand for such a level of transparency. It's a requirement that seems so obvious it doesn't need explaining any further. Its advantages are taken to be quite literally self-evident. But I think it's based on a kind of tacit assumption that the performance of a mental health service can be seen, and so it can be understood, evaluated, and improved. I kind of want to question that a bit, because I think expert systems that the practitioners exemplify within mental health care are practices that actually cannot fully be rendered transparent. Expert systems demand for their success and effectiveness a significant degree of trust in the expertise and understanding of the practitioner, and that's something that can't be evidenced or can't be evidenced only through information, data, and statistics. So one of the terrible effects of this persistent drive for transparency is that the language of accountability takes over the language of trust. And with more and more evidence and more data and more statistics, there are fewer and fewer people who have the time or the expertise to establish the validity of the claims being made. And of course, we see that vividly in technicolor detail at the moment with all the statistics available about COVID. But the problem with that is it leads not to increased trust in mental health practitioners, but rather to suspicion. And then the suspicion drives yet more calls for quality assurance and transparency, yet more calls for data and the kind of performance metrics that we were talking about earlier. So this tacit agreement to ignore this very painful paradox that the more you demand transparency, the less trust you have in public sector mental health practitioners, is what maintains the pull of transparency, despite what we know to be its harmful effects. Finally, let me turn to the myth of the medical cure for unhappiness. We know that feelings of sadness and loss and hostility and rage don't simply emerge within the psyche of the individual in the same way as symptoms of flu emerge within the body. What we call depression or anxiety is the consequence of a very complex interaction between the individual and his or her social environment, including factors such as poverty, isolation, and the kind of inequalities that, of course, have been laid bare by the COVID-19 crisis. So I think it's all the more surprising to see how the medical model is threaded throughout every aspect of the Iact programme. Its discourse, its methods, along with the use of very poorly validated but widely used psychiatric diagnoses, are explicitly and repeatedly and uncritically woven into all of its manuals and procedures and protocols. And those same diagnostic systems look set to be used in the new digital and algorithmic versions of therapy that are currently being planned for the NHS. All patients being treated, says the Iact manual, should receive an adequate dose of the treatment being provided. Iact clinicians should be able to clearly communicate the evidence base using an analogy to the use of antibiotics to illustrate the importance of the right dose of therapy to feel better. To look at that twice, actually, to sort of get it. But at least something is no longer quite so tacit here, because despite lip service being paid to the idea of an analogy, the explicit reference to the right dose of therapy makes it quite clear that the active ingredient being applied in psychological therapy is to be thought of in the same light as an antibiotic applied to fight infection. CBT, of course, is overwhelmingly privileged as a kind of penicillin. Of course, if all we need is a psychological form of penicillin, then there's little need to address the social, economic, and environmental problems that we know are increasingly evoking serious levels of mental distress. And of course, the psychological explanations now for unemployment are an increasingly commonplace and often, sadly, very humiliating aspect of people's experience of welfare. So the tacit agreement to ignore these growing inequalities of health, wealth, education, and privilege, and so forth, is one of the ways in which the myth of the medical cure for unhappiness maintains a very, very powerful attraction. Okay, I'm nearly finished. The problem, I think, for those of us who work in mental health is that the ongoing industrialisation of therapy has really resulted in a tremendously skewed landscape. Our neoliberal market for care has changed, I mean, it's really changed the parameters of our social consciousness. Mental health services have well and truly become embroiled within a political system whose agenda lies far beyond and actually undermines psychological health. The myth of the sovereign consumer means we're already positioned as consumers, ready and willing to accept forms of therapy convenient to the needs of the current political system. The myth of transparency means that many have lost trust in mental health professionals, relying instead on the presentation of a skewed evidence base to make decisions about their psychological care. And the myth of the medical cure ensures the responsibility for any psychological improvement will continue to rest firmly with the individual, not the political system in which the individual is based. Now, these myths are not innocent speech. They don't refer to objective facts, and I think rather they embody a particular way of understanding psychological distress and constitute an organizational means that serves ideological and political ends. And I'm hoping today we can find ways of thinking freshly about these issues and find ways of engaging politically and directly to call out and challenge what I've called these three modern myths of Iact. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rosie. That was excellent. Thank you so much. I'm just keeping track of the questions in the chat. Please feel free to put any in there as they arise. I just, one question that came up earlier, actually, Rosie, was about the pressure for people to engage in therapies when they're in receipt of benefits, which you've touched on. So the question is, what's the impact of this in terms of how you get informed consent from people, and also engagement when there's this coercion to engage in therapies?
Well, of course, it isn't therapy. If you have to engage in something in order to get enough food to eat or to put a roof over your head, how can it possibly be therapy? And I think that there's no engagement. We're talking about a very frightening situation, I think, where people feel compelled. Elizabeth used the term psychocompulsion. People feel compelled to go along with a sort of masquerade of therapy, a fake version of something. In many cases, it is felt to be. It may not be felt by everybody, but for a lot of people, it is felt to be a masquerade in order to live. And I think that the difficulty for many of us is watching the way therapists have become recruited, are forced to be recruited into this model. And the critique of that, it's not a complicated critique, but that critique is silenced, is not wanted to be heard, and it's very difficult to engage in a counter narrative that can kind of act against that idea that people need to be made to go to therapy in order to get better so that they can get benefits. Don't think that's going to work. I think that's one of the more worrying consequences of Iact.
The point to which I'm sure we'll return. So a couple of themes are coming out of the questions in the chat around people training to be therapists, and how they can make people aware of these issues, how these manifest themselves in training, I guess, whether there's capacity for resistance, but a specific. Oh, sorry,
I want to say something about that, because I work in training, and I feel for my students all the time, because many of them are training within Iact services. They may go into Iact jobs, and I think this comes back to it was a very important question about training. Do we simply train people in order to work within this kind of commodified model? Or do we train people with critical minds who may, perhaps to make a living, have to go into these models of care, but can retain critical minds in order to think about and work from within to change it? And I think the important word is critical here. We can't allow people to train in mental health and in forms of therapy without letting them know that this is not what therapy is or what it's supposed to be. This is something that this is a neoliberal agenda that has usurped therapy to create a gigantic sort of network of what is, in some cases, helpful for people, but in many cases is predicated on a particular ideology and philosophy that, in the main, I think, produces the emotional distress that it's supposed to be relieving.
Thank you, Rosie, and we will return to these issues. Thank you. And then I'm going to move next to our final speaker, who is Clare Slaney. So please tell me a bit about your experiences of working online, particularly during COVID-19.
Okay. Actually, for me, it's been great. I am low income, and I was having to commute at just ridiculous hours in the morning. I was getting up at 5:15 and getting into the office at 7 and seeing clients and paying for that room. And it was part of my routine. I thought nothing of it. My clients and I prepared to work online. We knew this was coming. And we transitioned into online work smoothly. There was a moment of about a week, 2 weeks for some people where, despite the presentation, they had to deal with other stuff. And so my practice collapsed for about a week, which made my hair stand on end. Everybody disappeared. I thought we had prepared, but actually, how do you prepare for something that no one living can remember? But then people came back pretty quickly. In the first 2 weeks, I offered a space to other therapists, Monday to Friday from 8 till 9. And a lot of therapists came online to just talk about how they were feeling. And what really struck me was how de-skilled so many people felt. These are adult people, many of them older than me, I'm 55, with great experience, on the phone to me saying, I don't know how to use the phone. On Skype with me saying, I don't know how to use Skype. And there was something about, I don't have a certificate in this, so I'm not allowed to do this. I don't have a certificate in how to use the phone, so I can't use the phone safely. Now, I don't have any official title, but between us, I was able to say, well, what are the principles? And this goes back to something that Rosie was saying. We need to learn the principles of what we're doing and why we're doing it, not to perform actions that get us through the hour without being sued. We have to be able to transfer principles into new situation. So at the time, there was an awful lot of one-upmanship, frankly, around, oh, well, Skype's terribly dangerous, you ought to use Zoom. Well, Zoom is terribly dangerous, you ought to use VC, and so on and so on. And this one-upmanship, this competitive nature was very striking. I don't know if we are more competitive than other groups. I've not been in accountancy groups or teaching groups, but this, well, I know better than you and I'm better qualified than you, was very striking. So there was both that, I am an expert, and I am a completely hopeless person, I'm helpless. That was more striking to me than the client work, actually. We moved over in a fairly straightforward way, and I continue to work online with clients, and I continue to get clients. It saves us money, it saves us a lot of travel and time, and they are in my home.
Yeah.
And I am in their home, and that brings another level of intimacy.
And that leads nicely actually on something I want to talk about in your political work. You talk about the commodification of therapy. So thinking about that, as Rosie was talking, that move to the transactional, picking up that point you just mentioned about the intimacy. So how is this commodification lived out within the profession in your view?
Well, it seems to me that therapist and client and patient have become the batteries, they've become the oil, the fuel for different processes. So we're taught how to be therapists, and that's a long, intense training about empathy and lack of judgment, and not lack of judgment, suspending judgment of what the client is saying and so on. And then you're in the real world where agencies need funding. And what's happened in agencies are places run by other therapists, where students get their hours. And the clients that we get our hours from are generally people who can't afford private therapy. So they're people with multiple problems. Many of these problems are not going to be solved. The housing problems are not going to be solved. Their lack of money isn't going to be solved. The interface with the DWP and various other services is not going to be solved. That's their problem, but they're coming to counselling because it's somewhere to come, and it shows the DWP that they're really ill. Look, I've been to counselling. So it's a series of performances. And in the agencies, there's a supervisory role in there run by qualified therapists who are now supervisors, often training as supervisors. And what used to happen is that agencies could write to funders and say, we're worthy, please give us money. And then outcome measurements came in. And we could say, we're better than that therapy agency. Look, here are our outcome measures. And then every therapy agency started using outcome measures. And what's happened is that those outcome measures have taken a life of their own. I want to really go back to what Rosie was saying, and I'd like a banner across here going, I'm critiquing the system, not the people. And just have that continuously running.
Yeah.
Because what I'm saying sounds terrible, and it is terrible, but people feel forced to work in this. And when it comes to funding agencies in a time of never-ending austerity, funders are now saying, we have got to take the best care that we can, that this money is being used properly. And they are starting to make demands. And funders are now saying, we need you to send us your timetable so that we know how many clients you're fitting in per day. And we are setting new targets now. So there's this horrible, I can't think of anything not colloquial to say, and I better not say it, but meaning has become really changed. We're not there to help clients anymore. Clients are there to help us get funding.
Yes. And I want to move to something you said actually about the psychotherapy and counselling world as being cannibalistic.
There's the ticker tape again. I'm not saying we're cannibals. I'm saying the system has made us cannibalistic. So Elizabeth spoke about how many of us work for free. I think it's worth at this moment just looking at some research that the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy did in 2014. They did some research on who their members are. The BACP are the largest membership group for counsellors and therapists in the UK. There's something like 50,000 members. So the typical counsellor is aged 53, works 12 to 13 hours a week, earns less than £10,000 a year. Yet in marketing terms, as defined in the survey analysis, she falls into the affluent achiever bracket, detached house, luxury car, buys wine and books on the internet, has an iPhone. The disparity between her income and expenditure suggests we can assume she is not the household breadwinner. Just 9% of BACP members earn more than £30,000 a year. 84% of us are female. Typically, we are the wives of rich men.
Yes, yeah, as Elizabeth was saying, yes. So I was going to pick up on that point about gender, and I'd like to know more, Clare, about your organising of counsellors and psychotherapists through the Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility. Please tell us about that.
Well, this organisation's been around for 20-something years now, and like so many of these small fringe organisations, there's a small membership. And frankly, it's been getting smaller because of the market forces on everybody. Therapists are no longer able to focus on social responsibility or social justice. We are all in this environment of pressure and achievement and performance. And it's really hard now. If I can just go back a step to this cannibalistic stuff, because it feeds into the marketization of what we're doing. It used to be that you could run a training program for 10 people, 20 people, and there was a whole swathe of small, intense groups getting a lot of really good work done in training new therapists. But the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work very well when you've got 10 people. And over the last 5 or so years, we've been, I mean, it's almost impossible to believe, but it's increasing, that there are courses with 70 trainees. You just can't do the personal work in that sort of environment. The personal work being encounter groups and process groups and supervision groups and peer supervision, and so you just can't do it. Now, I know that the people running these groups will say, you can and we do, and how dare you? But I'm going to propose that nobody wants to run a group with 70 people in it. It's the money that makes people do this. There are some very, very good therapists being turned out of these courses. But there are so many of us now that the only way for most, before this happened, the only way for most of us to make any income, because it's all voluntary work through agencies, is that we become supervisors who supervise trainees, who supervise each other, or we become trainers who train trainees and hire supervisees. So instead of our work being looking out into the world and how we can see the environment of the client or the patient, we are much more likely to be looking inwards. How do we survive? How do I present myself more attractively to supervisees and potential clients?
Exactly, yeah. Why do therapists work so incredibly hard, Claire? That's one of the questions we've got, which I think is a really interesting one.
Yeah, we're on 0 hours contracts. And if we don't work, we don't get an income. The huge majority of us fell outside of the furlough scheme. And it's our expenses are massive. Many people go into qualified work with £35,000 debt that they've accrued over many years, just to, and these are, you know, I was a nurse and a midwife before I started training, and I trained right on the edge of this becoming much more difficult to function in. So if you don't work, you don't get paid. That can have an impact on the relationship between the client and the therapist. But coming back to what Rosie was saying, if you have the foundations of why you're doing what you're doing, then that can be negotiated. There's a sort of a cliche in our work that if you can talk about it, it's all right. But if we can't talk about it between the client and the therapist, the potential for things becoming sticky there can be very realistic. The power imbalance is very great. The need to earn money or the need to make money by any means necessary, particularly these days, is really powerful. So, you know, we look to IAPT because it gives you the rare opportunity for sickness pay or maternity benefits, or, you know, this sort of thing, because being self-employed, you just don't get it. And interestingly, we may be tempted to work with the DWP. A lot of work has been done on therapists who work in IAPT. I am not aware of any independent research that's been done on therapists working for the DWP. I know anecdotally of some therapists who've worked with the DWP, and it's been catastrophic for them. And I'm not misusing that word.
Well, I think I can maybe enlighten you there, Claire. I know I'm the one asking the questions, but
I
think
do.
There's a number of us in the researchers who know basically that the DWP will not let you do research with their staff.
Right.
And this is the point
that
we
explains it.
turn to, even if it's publicly funded research, even if it's for the public benefits, and it fills a gap in the DWP's own commission research. yes, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion, but it is an issue that many of us have raised with them, that may be improving. But having said that, I've just started a piece of research on digital employment services, and I'm trying to get access, so we'll see how that goes. That may be the reason, but I think yeah, it would be interesting to know more from people who do research this area, whether they have tried to get access and haven't. So thank you, Claire, and I think we'll for raising that, and there's some of the questions that I've got for you that I'm going to put into that Elizabeth's going to put into the final discussion section.
Absolutely.
But there's something that I really want to ask, and I know, and Elizabeth wants me to ask as well, which is about inequalities in the consulting room. How do these get
Oh God, how long have I got? I think that's quite a serious question. How long do you want me to pitch my answer for?
Well, I think if we could make this the last question, but if we could have no more than 5 minutes,
yeah,
Claire,
okay.
Sorry, and then we'll move to the
that's
discussion.
fine. Okay. Well, the first financial barrier to get through is training costs. And these can be anything from £2,000 a year just for the training up to something like £15,000 a year. And on top of that, you've got to be able to pay for supervision. You have to pay for travel, childcare, personal therapy, which, you know, we all try and make that affordable for students, but you're not going to really get anyone doing it for under £25 a session, and you may need, I don't know, 100 sessions, maybe more, sometimes less. And that's every year. For most courses, not for all courses. The people that we train on, and I'm using that phrase knowing what I'm saying, we practice on the clients in training who are, I think I've said, people who can't afford personal therapy. So they are the lowest paid or not paid at all, people who have had multiple traumas, people who are really just hanging on. I think it's worth at this point saying something about the context that we are in and how that matches with employment. So we have been explicitly told that work is good for you. We've been explicitly told that work is a cure for mental ill health. Can you see this? Can you see this picture?
Yes.
Right. So this was an illustration to an article in Therapy Today, which is the BACP in-house magazine. And this is the illustration that went with the thing, work is good for you. And I am the godlike figure winding people up, broken. Do you see? They're broken. They don't know which way is up, these poor broken toy things. And I wind them up and off they go. I don't drop them straight into the blue thing. They're just over the void. They've got to fight now to stay on the blue working functional part. They've got to do it themselves, because if they don't, they're going to drop into the void.
Wow.
And I don't know if the artist knew what they were doing there, but that is so perfect to illustrate the, it's almost a class. I don't know any more if it is, because that's changed, but it's work will set you free, with all that entails. It's absolutely shocking. But as people and as therapists and as IAPT workers, that's the water within which we swim without even knowing that we are swimming. So the inequalities within that milieu are massive, and it's just started to rain, which is going to interfere with the recording. So tell me if it goes wrong.
Wow.
Let's pull it to a close, because this is going to interfere with what you can hear. There's so much more to talk about, Jo, so much more. But maybe we'll get to some of it
Yes.
in the Q&As afterwards.
I think so, Claire. And as I said earlier, there's, which issue of Therapy Today is that from? Quick question.
That is February 2009, I think.
Wow.
The archive, the BACP archive, finishes at 2009, I think. I couldn't get hold of that copy. This is one of the problems. I'm not an academic and I don't have access to all sorts of things. So, I'm very happy to be told what date that was.
Yeah, this is a big issue, and that's something that Wes actually, I mentioned earlier, that we'll see whether we can get the prize-winning paper made open access. We'll ask whether that can happen as alongside this event, but also Wes does make a lot of articles open access for coinciding with various times, and there are also some interesting open access developments coming down the line in the UK. So thank you so much, Claire. Apologies, we've had to cut it a bit short, but I'm definitely, I'm handing over to Elizabeth now. We're not going to take a break as advertised, but we really want to just focus on the questions that have been raised and try and get to those. And a quick note that we are recording the session, as you know, so just a reminder that if you want to speak or put your video on, just be aware that you are being recorded, and please raise your hand if you would like to speak. And I'm handing over to the wonderful Elizabeth Cotton now.
I was just thinking about the double meaning of you're being recorded. I mean, crikey, on what level are we not being recorded after this session? Don't want to make you paranoid. Clare Slaney, you have just shown everybody why I love you very much. Thank you very much for that contribution, because so much comes out of all of us. We were talking earlier about how really hard it is to digest our own experiences of being in this field and of this time. So we're kind of flooding, all of us, and you have contained us and held us. And I thank you very, very much for that. Now listen, folks, as always, we've run out of time. So there have been running themes. I've been looking at the Q&As. I'm not going to hand this out to individual questions. I'm going to ask each of you to answer the question, or for us to have a discussion about what should a post-pandemic service look like. And I'm asking you not to sort of, none of us are fantasists, so, we're not in a fantasy world, but particularly to speak to this idea of resistance, which is an important part of all of our experience as activists about how do we continue to operate, resist, and also provide care in this system. So I'm going to throw it open. What does a post-pandemic service look like?
There's something that we noticed at the start of the pandemic, which died a death and hasn't been mentioned since, which was the outpouring of people wishing to help each other. Do you remember that? In March, the government said, let us know, go and help your neighbours, get out and help out. Well, blow me down. I mean, so many people wanted to do that. And I remember thinking at the time that it showed something real, a real desire there, a real willingness, a real wish to be neighbourly and helpful. And there was something very touching and very authentic about people stepping forward and bothering. And what I worry about, you see, with the state of our mental health services at the moment, and I didn't really have time to go into this enough, but we've got used to something inauthentic. We've got used to pretending and making do, and people being told, yes, you're getting therapy, when actually what they're getting is a few phone calls from some very hardworking but frightened young person who wanted to get into a proper therapy training, hasn't been able to afford it for all the reasons that Claire was talking about, and finds herself dealing with people in great distress. This is not right, but I think the public has been sold a pig in a poke. And so, where do we start from? We need to start by educating people in something more meaningful, and perhaps through the kind of routes that Debbie was talking about, maybe through co-counselling, something more authentic, perhaps more informal, but not something that is subject to the kinds of ideologies that they're subject to when they go to their GP and get referred to a local Iact service. Again, coming back to this difference between critique and criticism, it's not to say that there aren't some very fine therapists working in Iact services, but the system, I think, acts against them. The system acts against them. So I think we have to find ways of training people to critique systems in cogent, measured ways that will be heard, and we have to find ways of developing new forms of therapy and counselling outside the system that helps people understand that they can get something better.
Wow, thank you. Clare Slaney.
Well, I'm just thinking about what's happening in front of me. I've got the rain coming down. I've got no control over that. I've got a Perspex skylight. I've got no control over that. My bell is going. My front doorbell is going. I've got no control over it. That's just the way it is. And I can pretend. I can just sit there and go, everything's all right. No, nothing's different. It's you. You're doing it wrong. I'm doing it right. We've got to learn to be flexible and to be able to have the confidence to stick to principles and know what those principles are, know why they are principles, and to offer something that is good enough. Years ago, the government asked rape and domestic violence agencies across Britain to help them with the two-child policy. And agencies in England said, yes, we'll do that. And agencies in Scotland said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to help you limit the amount of money that you give to children. We're not going to punish the children of people who have already been through the most traumatic situation. And I think we all need to look at the differences between the Scottish organisations and the English organisations and just ask what the differences may be. Without knowing anything about it, I'm going to think that it's something to do with solidarity and principles of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I fear that too many of us, in England maybe, want to dance for daddy. We want to be seen to be doing the right thing and then we won't be punished. Instead of saying, this is what I do, take it or leave it. Because clients will always want it and there's almost always a way through. We've got to be brave. We've got to stand on our own feet and say, this is what we do. Don't pay us if you don't like it. We'll find a way of doing it.
Gosh, that is beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I think that I agree with all of you, obviously, but I'm really struck by the introduction of the word solidarity right at the end here, and the sort of, it always comes in at the last minute, and about how precious it is. And I'm just sort of responding to Rose's point. So my own view is it isn't about therapy, it's about solidarity, is how we promote that form of relationality within the sector, whether we see that as, professional or client-led or both. God, it would be amazing to have both, wouldn't it? It would be really amazing to have that articulation. And I think that the issue of going back to principles is key, not just in an old-fashioned, that's what has to direct us, but in a really kind of both a political and a psychological level. I think psychologically, this is such a disorienting time. I mean, look, we're all smart. Therapists are massively overqualified. They don't need to do any more training. We're never going to get perfect videos, and it's not Tinder. It is what it is. But I think that it's you don't stand a chance of navigating this system if you are not fully conscious of your principles, and that means your politics. So first, it is a politicization process. Now, we didn't have the choice. We were politicized by circumstance. There's still some very lucky people who somehow feel that it isn't affecting them. Somehow this is happening to other people. So I think that consciousness raising, whatever your situation, whatever your position in this food chain, is key. And I also think that carving out the spaces where that can be done, which are not the traditional institutional spaces, they're not. Finding spaces outside of the systems that we're operating within is key. I think that the idea that, I'm ambivalent about this because I love a lot of people working in these institutions and I think they should stay because they're good people, but I also feel that time has run out now, that we need to create those spaces. So I would refer you to the Future of Therapy website, where there are no solutions at all, but there's a little guidebook on survival surgeries, which is just trades union organising methods on how you would start a conversation with people that you work with or people in your network about not just do we care enough about each other to do something, but actually get to the stage of doing something. How do you get to the stage of doing something collectively together to change the situation? So, sorry, go on.
Can I give a partial answer to that?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. The internet has really democratized information. We've got, in therapy, we've got this thing called the scope of education, something, scope ed, which is going to completely alter what therapists do and who they are. It tells highly experienced therapists that they can't manage self-reflection. It's just a mess. Now that the internet exists, we are networking there. And because it's hitting individual people, they're going, I'm outraged. They may not have been outraged when services were cut and people were made to stand on one leg for 3 times a week for the DWP, but because they are affected now by a scope ed, they're involved. Once they're politicized by looking at their own needs that are being poked or threatened, it broadens things out. I've avoided using the word solidarity because people can't endure it. It's like using the word neoliberalism. People go, oh, I know everything that you're going to say now. You've said the neoliberalism word, you've said the solidarity word, you're a Polish dock worker, And status is really, really important to therapists, massively. It's why we all want to be accredited, and now senior accredited and a PhD. And some of the most experienced therapists, they've been working for 35, 40 years. They're happy being therapists. There's a contentment, a lack of anxiety. And this is who I am. And frankly, it attracts clients. So, it's about getting back to our roots, what we do and why we do it.
Rosie.
Just very quickly, I know we're coming to an end. I was the old thing, it's difficult to speak truth to power. It's difficult. And it's frightening. And therapists, as Elizabeth was showing earlier on, are poorly paid, insecure. We've got jobs to hold on to, and it's difficult. It's difficult for mental health workers to speak truth to power, but that is actually what we have to do. And maybe that's what you're talking about in finding separate spaces from the institutions that we work in, who are also part of the establishment process, and find it very difficult when their members speak truth to power. But that's what we're doing today, isn't it? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to speak some truth. We're trying to, not the truth with a capital T, but a small local, our truth, Debbie's truth, as she was so eloquently sharing with us. We're trying to find ways of honestly sharing something truthful